When it comes to creating speed, propulsion gets all the love, but keeping drag low, keeping resistance low is just as important if swimmers want to go fast. And while many swimmers have opportunities to learn how to create more propulsion, they typically have just as many, if not more opportunities to go faster by keeping resistance low. And as with propulsion, the details can often make the difference. Hi everyone, Andrew here, helping you help your swimmers get faster. Optimal head position is a critical aspect of keeping resistance low. If the head's not in the right spot, the rest of the body tends to not be in the right spot either. And so what's absolutely critical is that swimmers figure out where they need to get the head, and they need to keep it there so that the rest of the body can follow through that same path. And unfortunately, because our eyes are in our head, because our brain is in our head, the body tends to follow the head. So if swimmers can get their head position right, a lot of times, a lot of the other aspects of alignment, the other aspects of keeping resistance low tend to fall into place. Now, what is effective head position? That can depend a little bit on the swimmer and how they go about doing things, but what's important is that they find a position that allows them to be effective and to create as little resistance as possible. Let's check out the details in all the strokes. In freestyle, effective head position is typically in the water. More of the head is going to be under the surface of the water, and that's going to allow swimmers to keep the chest down, which keeps the hips up. Especially in the sprints, swimmers tend to look down as well. You can see that here. They're not looking forward very much. They're keeping everything down and in line. Now, in distance swimming, we'll still see that same thing, and the head's going to come back down into alignment every time. So you can see her whole head comes back down underwater. Now, sometimes there are some athletes that will look forwards a little bit more. However, what you will not see is that their head is up and looking forwards. They've still got the chest pressed, and they're just looking forwards, and they're keeping everything in line, and that's different than having the head up in the water. And so again, most of the head is almost always going to be under the water. They may be looking straight down, they may be looking slightly forward, and in some cases they may be looking more forward, but they're always keeping that head pretty much submerged, and that's going to allow them to minimize resistance. And then from a front-on angle, what we'll see is her head's not moving all over the place. You can see most of that head's under the water, and it's super straight. It's not moving left to right. It's not moving side to side. It's not moving up and down. And so another key aspect of head position in freestyle is that it's stable, especially through the breath. It's not popping up much. It's not moving to the side, and that's allowing swimmers to move straight through the water as much as possible. So a low, stable head position is going to be really key for keeping resistance low. And with backstroke, we're going to see the same thing. So you'll see most of his head is going to be under the water. You can see the cap, you can see the name writing, you can see the flag on the side of his head. That's going to allow him to maintain a more optimal body position. And again, his head's not up. Everything's laying into the water. It's not moving up and down very much, and it's pretty stable in terms of where it's at. And just like we saw in freestyle, the head's not moving side to side much either. So the head is really stable here. You can see most of the lettering on the cap too. It's relatively under the surface of the water as well, but it's not moving up and down. It's not moving side to side. Everything's really stable, just like we want in freestyle. Everything's staying stable, everything's staying low, and everything's moving the body forward. Now, when it comes to butterfly and breaststroke, things are going to change a little bit. Obviously, we're not worried so much about the side-to-side motion. If that's happening, we've got way bigger issues than just the head position. But what we're looking for here is that the head's not moving too much. Obviously, it needs to come up to breathe, and you can see that here. Her head's coming up out of the water, but her whole body's not coming up out of the water. It's just her head. And then upon re-entry, the head's got to come down a little bit so the chest can press to get the hips up. But it's not diving down. You can see her head's not going all the way deep down under the water. It's going deep enough to get the hips up to maintain alignment, but it's not going so deep that it takes a long time for her to get back up out of that hole. And so the head position is going to lead the body position from an up and down motion here. And we're going to try to keep that wave relatively tight, not coming too high to breathe, and that not driving too far down in order to get the hips up. So keeping it relatively tight with the head position in the up and down motion, enough to facilitate the rhythm of the stroke, but not too much. And we'll see the same thing here with a different athlete. And so even then, she's got a pretty good chest press there, but that head's not diving down. She's getting right about there. So the whole head's going to go underwater, but it's not going to go that much further than that. And when she breathes here, the head's going to come up, disappear, but it's getting right back down fast. And you can see it's pretty much just enough elevation to get the head out of the water, not anymore. And so keeping that up and down motion, it's got to be there for the breath and for the recovery of the arms and then the reestablishment of alignment. but not any more than necessary. So keeping that wave, that up and down motion of the head pretty tight. And as much as the head goes, that's where the body's going to go. The higher up she breathes, the more the hips are going to go down, the more the shoulders are going to come up. And the lower she presses, the more that the chest is going to follow, and that's going to cause more resistance. So what we're looking for is enough. And breaststroke is very similar in this regard. So he's going to come up enough to breathe and to recover the arms effectively, and then he's going to get that head back down. But he's not diving down. Those arms are going straight forward, and the head's going straight forward. Everything's getting back into alignment, not diving down. So that's going to let him get his hips back up. It's going to let him get back into the next stroke cycle quickly, but it's clean. It's not excessive up and down motion. So he's just getting his head back down, just like he would in freestyle. That's more or less the same position that they're going to be in. Head right at the surface, maybe slightly submerged, maybe a little bit deeper here in breaststroke, but probably not as deep as butterfly. And then coming up and breathing there. And so the breath is going to be a little bit higher. He's getting a little bit more elevation there as compared to butterfly, but he's not diving down quite as deep. So the total amplitude of the head is probably going to be pretty similar. It's just raised up a little bit higher in the water. And again, where the head goes, the body follows. So the head comes up here, and that's going to allow him to breathe effectively, to recover the arms effectively, and then the head's going to drop back down here to get the hips back up in line. You can see them pop up right there. So another swimmer here, you can see the head comes up, allows her to breathe and set up the recoveries, and then she's pressing back down, but she's not diving down there at all. Her arms are right up at the surface still, going right forward, and then the head is right up at the surface as well. So she's getting the head back down enough to getting back into alignment there. You can see everything is really straight. Everything's really tight. If she were to keep the head up, that's going to make it more difficult for her to get her alignment. And then also if she drives the head down, that's going to create a lot of unnecessary up and down motion. And so you can kind of see that with the swimmer below. She recovers down there, and then she's got to come back up out of it. Where the swimmer in front of us, she dives right back down, and then she's right at the surface. She's not diving deeper. She's just getting back into alignment every time. And so where the head goes, the body follows. And if you look at the swimmer below, the head and the arms go a little bit deeper. The body follows that path, and then it kind of rides back out of it. That's just going to take more time. So cleaner with the head positions is going to be more effective if swimmers can get up high enough to breathe and to recover the arms effectively, and then they got to get back down into alignment, but not too far down because that's going to disrupt alignment. So it's finding that sweet spot with the head right at the surface of the water, and that's going to allow swimmers to keep their resistance as low as possible. Swimmers may be able to move through the water with their head in more or less an effective position, but if they can't control their spinal position, if they're arching the back excessively, they're still going to create a lot of resistance, and that ultimately is going to slow them down. We're going to talk about another drag detail here, and that is arching the back. Swimmers have to be able to maintain a relatively straight spine, especially in freestyle and backstroke throughout most of the stroke cycle. And in butterfly and breaststroke, they have to be able to arch the back to breathe, but they need to be able to get back into a straightened position after each stroke cycle. And if they can't, they're probably going to be creating a lot more resistance as they move through. And the same thing applies to underwater kicking. If that back is arched, it's going to be a lot more difficult to undulate effectively. And so swimmers have to manage their spinal position in order to minimize the amount of resistance to maximize the amount of speed. Let's check it out. If we watch these freestylers here, what you'll see is while the head's definitely in a solid position, you won't see a huge arch in the back where their belly button is pressed down to the bottom of the pool and they've got a big bow in the back. And so while that arch can allow the hips and the head to be right at the surface of the water, it's going to create a ton more resistance because the belly is dropping down into the water, and this water is just going to hit that. It's like hitting the brick wall. And so the more that swimmers can keep their spine relatively straight, there's going to be some bend, there's going to be some arch, and that's okay. It just needs to be moderated and needs to be controlled. And so you can see these swimmers here, they're moving, their stomach is relatively flat to the surface of the water, and that's going to allow them to minimize the amount of resistance they create as they move forward through the water. You can see the same thing here with a distance swimmer. As he gets in this position, you can see his spine is relatively straight. There's not a huge arch in the back. He's not really pressing down into the water with his chest or with his stomach, and that's going to allow him to kind of just slice through the water nice and smooth. Again, there's going to be some natural arch in the back. That's okay. What we're trying to avoid is a big arch in the back where swimmers are creating a ton of resistance by pressing the front side of the body down towards the bottom of the pool. And so that position right there is kind of what we're looking for, pretty much straight from head to toe. The head's in the right position, but the spine is also in the right position, and that allows swimmers to minimize the resistance and create more speed. Now, if we watch backstroke here, the consequences of an arched back can probably be more significant. And so if that happens, the head might be in the right position, but the stomach, the chest is almost going to be out of the water. But the problem is that's going to push the hips really far down, and that's going to make it a lot more difficult to kick. And so his hips are sitting down a little bit, but that allows him to get the feet up and kick more effectively. If the back is arched, that's going to push the feet straight down to the bottom of the pool. And if the feet are pushing straight down to the bottom of the pool, they are absolutely going to be creating a ton of resistance. It's going to be very difficult to get them up to the surface. It's going to take a ton of energy if swimmers can even make it happen. And when the hips are low, that's like putting on the brakes. The water's going to hit the swimmer's shoulders. It's going to travel down their back, and it's just going to come to a complete stop when it hits the hips. And so the more that swimmers can keep the back a little bit rounded, you can see his back's a little bit rounded here. That's going to allow them to maintain a more effective position and create a lot less resistance as they move through the water. Butterfly is where things can get a little bit trickier. And so in order to breathe effectively, you can see there, swimmers are going to have to arch in order to get the arms out of the water. That's a pretty arched position here. But when she recovers, she presses back down out of that, and then she actually goes back down into an arch and then pulls herself out of it. The back straightens a little bit, then it arches again. And so it's the ability to move in and out of that position that's going to be really important in butterfly. And so if swimmers can't arch down a little bit in the front of the stroke, it's going to be hard to get that undulation that allows them to lift up out of it. And if they can't arch here, right there, when the arms come out, it's going to be difficult to recover the arms. And so right when the head and the chest presses back in, you can see there, she's got to get out of that arch, and then she goes into it. And then as she pulls right there, she's going to come out of that arch and then goes back into it. And then again, comes out of it and then goes back into it. And so it's the ability to dynamically manage spinal position in butterfly that allows swimmers to get the mobility to pull effectively and to recover the arms effectively, like right there. But they also have to get out of those positions well. If they get stuck in those positions, she's not going to be able to get back in line like she does right here. And then also during the pull itself right here, she's not going to be able to get back into alignment during the most powerful part of the pull. And then afterwards, she's got to arch to recover those arms, and she's got to arch right there in order to set up the pull. So again, it's a lot more dynamic in butterfly. Swimmers have to move in and out of that position. They need to arch a little bit to optimize the setup of the pull, and they need to arch there to optimize the recovery of the arms, but they've got to get back into alignment right there in order to set the stroke up again, and they've got to get back into alignment through the most powerful part of the pull right there in order to maximize their speed. If swimmers can't do both, they're going to be in trouble. Breaststroke is pretty similar to butterfly, but with a major difference. And so there's going to be a much more significant arch here to breathe, to pull, and to recover the legs. But swimmers are going to get back into alignment and get back into a totally straight position after each stroke. And so if she was really arched here, she had her chest pressed down, her stomach pressed down, her back arched, she's going to create a lot more resistance when she kicks there. And that's going to be really important to get back into alignment to keep the spine pretty straight. On the other hand, if she keeps everything straight here, she's really going to struggle to breathe. She's really going to struggle to recover the arms effectively, and she's going to really struggle to recover the legs effectively. But then back into alignment, really straight, really effective. So there's only one transition from arched to straight in breaststroke, but those positions are a lot more extreme. She's a lot more arched here, and she gets into a really straight line here. So it's the same concept, the same idea, but it's happening in a little bit different way, in a little bit different context. Now, if we watch underwater kicking here, there's going to be range of motion happening through the spine. However, it's not very big, and it's moving from rounded to arched in slight ways, as opposed to just being stuck in an arched position. And so by allowing the spine to arch right there, and then round right there, you're allowing swimmers to create propulsion by undulating, but also keeping resistance relatively low. If they were just kicking from an arched position all the way through, they're going to be creating a lot more resistance, and that's going to be negatively impacting the amount of speed that they create. And so relatively straight with the spine as they go through, there's a wave action for sure, but it's not happening from an arched position all the way through. If someone's trying to kick like that, it's going to be like putting on the brakes, and that's definitely not what we want to do, especially when they're going underwater. The legs get a lot of focus because the kick is obviously a critical aspect of creating a lot of speed. However, the focus is often on the intensity and the effort behind the kick rather than the skill of the kick. And again, the focus is often on the amount of propulsion that can be created in order to help swimmers go fast. But what's also critical to consider is how much drag is created when swimmers are kicking, because the more resistance they create, the slower they're going to swim. A great kick is really important in all the strokes for creating speed. And sometimes the impression can be given that more is better. A really effective kick is going to create a lot of propulsion, but at the same time, a really effective kick has to create as little resistance as possible. And that can become an issue of trade-offs because the bigger the kick is, the more potential propulsion that can be created. But when the kick is really big, it's also possible to create a lot of resistance during that kick. And past a certain point, that kick starts to create more and more resistance for less and less propulsion, and ultimately that results in less speed. So optimizing the kick is not just about making it big and powerful, it's about creating as much propulsion as possible with as little resistance as possible. So let's check out what that looks like in some different contexts with swimmers that are doing a really great job of balancing the two. So we'll start off here looking at distance swimmers, and we're certainly looking at one of, if not the best, and how she manages her kick in order to create as much speed as possible, balancing the amount of propulsion and resistance that she's creating. So this is an example of a really efficient kick that's not creating a ton of propulsion, but it's also creating very little resistance. And the reason that that's so important is because over longer distances, it's all about efficiency and creating as little resistance as possible so that there's as little energy used as possible, and as much of the energy that is used is directed towards helping swimmers move down the pool as quickly as possible. And so if you see here, the kick depth is going to be really shallow, and she very rarely kicks beyond the shadow of her body. And so her legs are staying right at the surface, and she's getting something out of those kicks, but she's not having a deep kick, because the deeper the kick is, the more resistance she's going to create. And while it may create a little bit more propulsion, it's not worth it because it's going to create a lot more resistance, and that's going to slow her down. And again, it's all about efficiency. So she's going to have a kick that's going to be a lot more subtle. It's not going to be a big thunderous kick, because that's going to take a lot more energy, and it's going to create a lot more resistance, which isn't going to lead to sustainable speed. So again, it's the depth of the kick that matters here. It's not going to be very deep at all, and when she does kick, she keeps it pretty shallow, and that allows her to get some speed, something out of the legs, but there's very little risk in terms of creating a lot of resistance. If we look at the swimmer behind her, she's got a steadier kick, she's got a stronger kick, but if you watch, there's very little depth to it. So right there is about as deep as it gets, and she's pretty much in line with her body. And so she does not have a deep kick at all, and that's allowing her to get something out of the legs to create some propulsion, but there's very little risk of creating resistance, which is going to slow her down and increase the energy demands, which is the last thing you want to do over an 800-meter swim. So the shallower swimmers can keep the kick, the less resistance they're going to create, also less propulsion, but more importantly, they're going to save energy, which is going to allow for sustainable speed. Now, in contrast here, we have a 100-meter race, which is going to be a lot more intensity. The legs are going to be a lot more important, and so there's going to be a lot stronger kick here. But still, we're not getting really deep with the kick, and so that's about as deep as it's going to be. It is a little bit outside the body line, but it's not dramatically outside the body line. And so right there is probably the biggest depth, and only that foot is dropping out of alignment. Everything else is still staying within the shadow of the body pretty well. And so again, that allows swimmers to create a lot of propulsion because they've got a big, strong kick, but they're not creating a ton of resistance. If his foot was another 6 inches lower, maybe he could get a little bit more propulsion out of it. But again, that's going to drop that leg way out of the body line, and that's going to create a ton more resistance. So it's all about managing the resistance that's created and the propulsion that's created, and trying to find a balance between the two. And that balance is going to be probably a little bit different depending on the event and depending on how much energy swimmers can expend. The shorter the event, the more energy they can use, probably the kick's going to be a little bit bigger. And we see that with this race as opposed to the one we just saw. If you watch the other swimmers in this heat, you can see that the thigh doesn't drop too far out of line. It's that foot that drops a little bit more. Again, keeps the profile of the body smaller, but still allows for a bigger range of motion for the foot to get more propulsion. Now, if we watch him coming back on the other side, you can see here again, the kick is going to be dropping a little bit out of the alignment, but not very much. And again, it's to maximize the amount of propulsion that's created, and it's mostly the foot that's dropping out there as opposed to the whole leg. So this is probably the biggest resistance that's going to come out from the thigh. And again, it's not too low, it's low enough to create a lot of propulsion, but trying to find the balance between creating propulsion and creating resistance to optimize speed. Now, if we take a look at backstroke, we're going to see kind of the same thing, is that the thigh itself tends to stay within the shadow of the body for the most part, and then occasionally that foot's going to drop down so it can create more propulsion. So that allows the surface area of the foot to face backwards without dropping the whole leg down. And that allows for more propulsion with a little bit less resistance. So we'll see the thighs are staying in a pretty tight window in terms of how much range of motion that they're using. And then the feet are dropping down a little bit more. And that allows swimmers to create more propulsion with the foot without exposing the whole leg to the flow of the water, which would cause a lot more resistance. And so a tight kick from the thighs and a little bit bigger kick from the feet is usually what you're going to see here. And that's going to allow swimmers to optimize the effectiveness of the kick, creating more propulsion and less resistance. So trying to find a kick depth that creates as much propulsion as possible with as little resistance as possible. That's usually going to require a pretty tight kick from the thighs and a little bit looser kick from the feet. And that allows swimmers to position the foot backwards for a little bit longer to get a little bit more out of it without compromising the overall body position and the resistance that's created by the thighs and the legs as they move through the water. So in butterfly, we're going to see the same dynamics, although it's going to be a little bit different, and especially it's going to differ between the kicks. So if we watch this kick here at the back of the stroke, you're going to see that the legs are going to drop down more, and that's going to create a little bit more resistance, but that's necessary in order to create the body angle and the propulsion to get the upper body up out of the water and to create enough speed and enough arm speed to recover the hand smoothly over the water. So from that position, you're going to see the knees drop a little bit more, and you're going to see that across the field, you'll see the knees drop down. And then when they get to the front of the stroke, that kick tends to be a lot shallower. One, because they're horizontal in the water, they don't need to move the body up in the water. But two, that kick is all about getting the swimmer back into alignment as opposed to just creating a lot of propulsion. And so a tighter kick, a snappier kick, is going to allow the hips to pop up, but it's not going to create a ton of resistance, which is exactly what we don't want in that part of the stroke. And so again, the legs are going to drop here to get that lift up out of the water, and that's going to create more resistance, but that's the trade-off that swimmers have to manage. Better kickers, it's going to be subtle. You may not even be able to see it, but they may be able to elevate the body, get a really strong second kick without creating as much resistance, without dropping the legs quite as much. If you look across the field, you're going to see some swimmers drop the knees more, which is going to create more resistance. Now, they may have to do that to recover well, but if they can reduce the amount that the knees drop down, they may be able to create less resistance, and that may help them swim faster. So if we watch the third swimmer from the top here, their knees are going to drop pretty low there. And if we watch the second swimmer from the top, the knees aren't dropping quite as much. And so that might be an advantage for that swimmer. It may be a trade-off that they're better able to optimize because they can get the lift that they need without creating as much resistance, without dropping the knees down as much. And so butterfly, especially because it creates a lot of resistance, it's all about finding ways to minimize resistance, and the kick can be part of that because it is an aspect that creates propulsion but also resistance. And so if swimmers can find ways to have a really effective kick without having to drop the knees quite as far, they may be able to create more speed. Breaststroke is a little bit different in that swimmers are going to create a lot of resistance when they recover the thighs, no matter what. So we watch this position here. You can see the swimmer second from the top. That's going to create a lot of resistance. And if we watch the other swimmers as they go through that, swimmer at the top there, a lot of resistance. And then the third swimmer from the top, again, a lot of resistance in that position. And so to set up the kick effectively, to create a ton of propulsion, that's necessarily going to create resistance. So swimmers have to bring the thighs up. And when they do that, it's going to slow them down. Now, the key is, can they still set up the kick just as well, just as effectively, hold that kick throughout the entire time, and find ways to make the amount of resistance they create slightly smaller? If they can create a little less resistance, that's going to help them go faster, and considering how much resistance is created, a small difference can make a big difference in terms of speed. This is a situation where it's not just about how much propulsion the kick can create, it's about how much resistance is created through the recovery. And so if swimmers can figure out how to have a little bit better alignment, a little bit better streamline when they recover the legs, or they can make it happen faster so that they're not in those positions for as long. That's going to create an advantage for them as well. So breaststroke is particularly difficult because they do have to recover the legs in a way that creates a lot of resistance. But if swimmers can find a way to minimize or slightly reduce the amount of resistance that they create, they're going to be able to go through the water with more speed, and it's going to take a lot less energy, which means they're going to be able to sustain that speed better. However, they have to make sure that they don't compromise the effectiveness of the actual kick, because the kick in breaststroke creates a ton of propulsion, and swimmers need that in order to move quickly down the pool. Drag kills speed, and so when it comes to reducing the impact of drag, the details matter. In many cases, it's the little skills that can all add up to slower swimming. One of those details is the entry of the arms, and especially as swimmers are starting to go really fast and stroke rates start to pick up, those arms can start crashing into the water, and not only is that going to disrupt the next propulsive cycle, it can increase the amount of drag, which is going to slow swimmers down. When the hands enter the water, they're moving at really high speeds, and they're moving opposite of the direction that the swimmer is moving. And so that means if they come in, they hit the water's moving backwards against that hand, that's going to create resistance, and that resistance can slow swimmers down. Now, is that going to make a huge difference if the swimmer is moving through the water at almost a vertical position? No, not necessarily, but when we're talking about faster swimming speeds, when we're talking about swimmers trying to take their swimming to the next level, these details can make a difference. And so the more effective that swimmers are in entering the water cleanly, the less resistance they're going to create when the hand enters the water, and that means they can swim faster. And while we're not necessarily going to discuss it in this video, the sloppier the entry, the more difficult it becomes to get the arm in an effective position to create a lot of propulsion. So for those two reasons, having great entries, having clean entries is really important. And in this video, we're going to focus on the impact of poor entries on creating more resistance. Let's check it out. So in freestyle, when the hand enters the water, the more it can pierce the surface of the water versus crashing or slapping through the surface of the water, the less resistance swimmers are going to create. And this is especially true in sprint freestyle when the hands are moving really fast. And the faster the hands are moving, the more resistance, the more drag that's going to be created at entry, regardless of how effective that entry is. And so the better the entry can be, the less resistance there's going to be, and the impact of that entry becomes bigger and bigger the faster that swimmers want to go. And one way to judge the impact of the entry is to pay attention to the turbulence, the air bubbles that's created upon entry. And so if there's a ton of turbulence, there's a ton of bubbles, that generally signifies that the swimmer has not entered the water cleanly. And that's just like when they dive off the blocks, a big splash usually means a lot of resistance. The same thing is happening with the entry. And so especially at high speeds, there's gonna be some turbulence, and that's okay. It's about trying to minimize that. And so this is an Olympic champion, and so she's obviously doing a pretty good job here, but there's still going to be some turbulence. But if you watch, that hand is entering pretty cleanly. There's not a lot of excess motion. It's a direct motion. It's getting right into the water. And while there's some turbulence, there's not a whole lot. And so there's turbulence surrounding the hand, but it's not going all the way up the arm. It's not all over the place. And so she has a really direct, a really clean entry, and that is allowing her to minimize the amount of resistance that she creates. And so if we were to see a hand that slaps straight down, and sometimes you can literally hear poor entries because they're creating so much resistance, they're literally making noise. You can also see it when there's just kind of like a bomb that goes off when the hand enters the water in terms of the splash. And so what we're looking for is super direct, super clean, not a lot of turbulence, not a lot of noise, not a lot of splash. And this swimmer is doing a really good job of that. And so again, the more direct it can be, the cleaner it can be, the less resistance is going to be created. And of course, that's going to set up an effective pull as well. And so when we watch backstroke here, it's the same thing. You want the hand knifing in. You don't want to hear a lot of noise. You don't want to see a lot of turbulence. You want things to be clean. And so from this swimmer here, you can see that there's not much turbulence when he enters the water. There isn't a whole lot of bubbles, and he's not carrying that through the stroke. And you can also see too, he kind of knifes into the water. He's not just slapping it with the back of his hand. And so again, the more that the entries can be really clean, the more effective they're going to be, and the less resistance that swimmers are going to create when the hand goes into the water. One key difference in backstroke as compared to freestyle is that while in freestyle, the hand's going to enter somewhat flat, it may be at a slight angle, but it's going to be more or less flat. Backstrokers tend to enter with the pinky down a little bit more. That allows them to slice in a little bit better and then get into an effective position quickly. And so while you'll see some turbulence, that's going to be part of the deal, especially at really high speeds. And this is one of the challenges of swimming really fast, is that the faster the arms move, there's still a premium on entering really cleanly, and as discussed earlier, because the hands are moving fast, they can tend to create more resistance for a given entry, and so swimmers have to be better with the entries when the hands are moving even faster, one, to set up the stroke, but here, in this context, to reduce the amount of resistance that's created as they enter the water. So cleaner entries, more speed, and when swimmers are taking a lot of strokes, that starts to add up. So we'll take a look at butterfly here, and it's going to be the same dynamic. Cleaner entries, less sound, less bubbles, less turbulence, the more effective swimmers are going to be at minimizing the amount of resistance they create when they enter the water. So if we watch this swimmer here, she's going to enter with the hands turned out slightly, but she's entering fingertips first. She's slicing into the water and then reducing the amount of resistance she creates when she does that. And she's also not crashing down through the front of the stroke. And that's a particular issue, especially with butterfly, because the arms are swung so ballistically, it can be difficult to manage the front of the stroke, not crash through the beginning, not crash into the front. And if swimmers can do that effectively, they're going to be a lot better at minimizing the resistance and setting up the stroke. A lot of times what you'll see is the hands are kind of swinging in together and they're almost crashing in together. And then that can create a lot of resistance because hands are knifing in from the side as opposed to moving forwards. And so just like freestyle, just like backstroke, it's about creating a clean entry to minimize the amount of resistance that's created. Especially at high stroke rates, the impact of poor entries is going to be magnified. So some key things to look for are the trajectories of the hands. Are they moving forwards as opposed to just down or in? It's also important to watch for the amount of turbulence that's created. The more turbulence there is, the more likely it is that they're creating drag upon entry. And then lastly, it's really important to listen to the sounds that swimmers are making. The louder the stroke, generally speaking, that means they're creating more resistance, which means less speed. So in all the strokes, if swimmers can develop direct entries, relatively silent entries, and clean entries in terms of the turbulence they create, they're going to reduce the amount of resistance they create, which means they're going to be able to go faster. To create as little drag as possible, swimmers need to move through the water as smoothly and as straight as possible. If they're bouncing up and down when they swim, they're not going to be accomplishing that objective, and they're going to be creating a lot more resistance. While there's necessarily going to be up and down motion in breaststroke and butterfly, there shouldn't be in backstroke and freestyle because swimmers are rotating rather than undulating. The more that they can swim straight, avoid bouncing, the less resistance they're going to create and the more speed they're going to create. Fast freestyle, fast backstroke is all about minimizing resistance by swimming as straight through the water as possible. Unfortunately, a lot of swimmers tend to bounce up and down when they swim, and that's creating a lot more resistance as they move through the water. The more that they can learn to swim level in the water and maintain a stable position in the water, the more effective they're going to be when they swim. Let's take a look at some elite athletes that do an amazing job of staying level and straight in the water, and we'll talk a little bit about what might be causing swimmers to bounce up and down. So this is a 50 freestyle, and what we're going to pay attention to is not just his head position, but how his head position doesn't move up and down even at really, really high speeds. And that's going to be absolutely critical because that's going to further minimize the amount of bouncing that happens and the amount of resistance that's created as a result. And so if you watch, his head is absolutely rock solid. The goggles aren't moving up and down. You can't see the head move up and down. And as a result, the body's not moving up and down. And so that's going to mean less resistance. The more that swimmers can knife through just like that, the faster they're going to be able to go because of less resistance. Less resistance means more speed. And so if we watch here, the opportunities to start bouncing mostly happen upon entry. And so if the swimmer is going to crash down through the entry, that's going to press down on the water. That's going to push the body up. And not only does that happen upon entry, but during the first part of the pull, so he's entering the water, he's setting up the stroke, and now he's applying pressure. If swimmers apply pressure straight down in through the catch, that's going to press them up out of the water as well. And since the hands are alternating back and forth between one side and the other, that's going to cause a bouncing action where they press, then they fall back down, they press with the other arm, they fall back down, they press with the other arm, they fall back down. And so you can see here, he's entering pretty clean. You can see the whole hand there, that's pretty clean. And then also, he's patient, and then he starts applying pressure at that point. And by the time he applies pressure, he's already got his arm more or less facing backwards, and so he's not just pressing through the front of it, which is going to push his body up in the air, and what goes up comes back down, and now we've got a lot of resistance and we've got problems. So by maintaining a really good hand entry and a good patient setup of the stroke, not applying pressure right away, he's able to keep that head position exactly where it needs to be, and he's not creating extra resistance by bouncing up and down. So we'll take a look at the same thing from a different angle, a different swimmer. And what you can see is that there's really stable position with the head, and that's going to allow him to maintain a lower amount of resistance. And so again, clean entries. He's not pressing through the front of the stroke. You can see the hand enters there, and then he doesn't really accelerate until right about there, and the hand is more or less facing backwards by that point, and that allows him to create a lot more propulsion, but also he's not pressing through the front of the stroke and lifting his body. Now, the faster swimmers want to go, the more difficult this is to make it happen because the stroke rates get higher. One, you're going to have a more ballistic entry, and two, it's harder to get that timing down when the arm speed, the tempo is really high. It's hard to be patient in the front of the stroke and apply pressure at the right time. And so it becomes very difficult to do it. And that's one reason you tend to see bouncing happening more in sprinting, because it's a lot harder to manage these skills at really high stroke rates. And because the arms are moving faster, not only do they have less time to get it right, there's a lot more energy entering the water, and it's harder to manage that. So the more that swimmers can be patient in the front of the stroke at really high stroke rates and are clean, then they're not going to be bouncing as much when they move through the water. Again, it becomes very difficult to do at really high speeds, and so even with this swimmer, there's a slight amount of up and down motion, but the goal is to keep it as low as possible, and the more that swimmers can be effective with the entries and effective with the setup of the stroke, the more they're going to be able to make that happen. Now, the same thing is going to be happening here in backstroke. And so the hands are going to be slapping into the water, and because it's a straight arm recovery, the arm recovery tends to be a lot more ballistic, and it's even more challenging to enter really cleanly, but these backstrokers are doing a really good job of it. So if you watch, the head position stays really stable. The head is staying right in the same place. The cap is not moving around. You can see the logos on the side of the cap. They're not moving around much. They're certainly not going up and down. There's maybe a little bit of head turn, but that's not necessarily a problem. And they're moving at high stroke rates. This is a 100-meter race, and they're getting after it, but they're still being really stable with the head because they're being really clean with the entries. And so while backstrokers aren't necessarily pressing through the front of the stroke like they might in freestyle, they do have a more ballistic entry with the arm recoveries, and so they have to manage that as well. And so as you can see, as you look across the pool here, the head positions are really stable. There's not much bouncing, and I'm sure you've seen that when you've seen your swimmers. You've seen them really bounce up and down, and that's a large part because of what's happening with the entry, what's happening with the beginning of the stroke. And so that the more that swimmers can find a way to keep the tempo really high, but enter cleanly, not press through the beginning of the stroke, they're going to be able to keep the head more stable. They're not going to be bouncing up and down. And every time they do that, they're just creating more resistance, which is creating more drag, which means less speed. So we'll take a look at the same thing with a 50 backstroke. And you can see, even at really high speeds, these swimmers are being really stable with the head position. They're not bouncing up and down, and they are definitely entering the water with really high rates. And so it's really important to note that they're doing so by entering cleanly. You can see that swimmer's not taking a whole lot of bubbles down with him. He's entering real clean, and then he's setting up the stroke, and then he's letting it rip. And there's going to be some cavitation. There's going to be some turbulence after he starts applying pressure, but that's not necessarily the bubbles that he's bringing down with him. So really clean entries in backstroke allow for really stable head position. That means less resistance, and if they're entering cleanly, they're more likely to get an effective setup of the stroke as well. And while you're not likely to see the same amount of bouncing in butterfly, especially as there's going to be a natural undulation of the stroke as well, if swimmers are crashing through the front of the stroke, if they are pressing through the front of the stroke, that's going to lift the body a little bit unnecessarily. And considering that butterflyers are trying to press the chest to get the hips up in the front of the stroke, if they're slamming through the entry, they're pressing down on the entry, they're pressing down on the setup of the stroke during the catch, that's going to prevent them from getting in position. And so if you have swimmers that are really struggling to get the hips up, you're not necessarily going to see the same bouncing again like you do in freestyle and backstroke. However, you have the same issue with pressing through the front. It's going to prevent them from getting and maintaining an effective body position. It's going to prevent them from getting the hips up. And so you have the same issue there. So the more swimmers can learn to enter cleanly and just as importantly be patient with the setup of their stroke, the less resistance they're going to create by disrupting body position, by elevating the upper body when they press down through the front of the stroke. And the more resistance they create, the less speed they're going to create. The straighter swimmers can move through the water, the faster they're going to swim. The more that there's going to be side-to-side motion, the more wiggling they're going to have as they move through the water, the more resistance they're going to create, and the slower they're going to go. In terms of creating resistance and creating drag, there's a lot of attention in terms of how swimmers move, especially in freestyle and backstroke, horizontally along the surface of the water. But just as important is whether they're moving side to side and wiggling through the water as well. The more side-to-side motion of the head, the more side-to-side motion of the shoulders, the more side-to-side motion of the hips, the more surface area they're going to be exposing as they move forward through the water. And that means they're going to be creating a whole lot more resistance. If swimmers can learn to keep everything straight, keep everything tight, and keep everything moving forward, they're going to be able to create a lot less resistance, and that means more speed. Of course, there's a range of possibilities in terms of how much side-to-side motion there is. At one extreme, they're going really straight, and at the other extreme, they're all over the place. Everything in between can be potentially problematic. It's more a matter of how problematic it's going to be, and the more side-to-side motion there is, the more potential problems there are. To see what this looks like when done really well, let's check out some elite swimmers and discuss some of the mistakes that are made that cause swimmers to swim more side-to-side. So if we watch this swimmer here, what we're going to see is hardly any wiggling. She's doing a really good job of keeping that head extremely stable. And while there's going to be rotation of the hips and the shoulders, they're not moving side to side. They're kind of moving up and down as they rotate through the water. So she's keeping everything really clean, really straight. And what we might see is if that head starts moving side to side, the shoulders start moving to side, and then the hips start moving side to side. So what might cause that to happen? Well, if she's entering the arms here, and you can see it enters right over her shoulder, if that arm was entering behind the head, that's going to pull the head to the side, that's going to pull the shoulders to the side, it's going to push the hips in the other direction. Likewise, if she's pulling here, she's doing a good job of pulling straight back. If she was pulling and pressing out to the side, that can cause her to wiggle as well. And then if we watch the other arm entry, again, right over her shoulder, it's not behind her head, it's not way out to the side. And then when she sets up the stroke, she's not putting pressure on the water until she's pulling straight back right there. If she was pulling to the side, pressing out, or maybe even pulling in too much, that's where you start to get more of those lateral motions as well. And so as much as anything else, it's about not performing movements that are going to cause wiggling to happen in the first place. So really stable head position, really direct arm actions, and that keeps everything moving straight down the pool. As we can see from these swimmers, really stable head positions allow the body to move straight through the water. You can see that those heads aren't moving around at all, and then the arm entries are happening right over the shoulders, right there, on the left arm, right there on the right arm, and that's preventing the body from moving side to side because the arms, the torque of the arms, isn't pressing the body and moving the body around. So really stable head positions, really direct arm entries, really direct arm pulls, that's going to keep everything moving straight down the pool, and that's going to keep resistance low and speed high. Now, if we take a look at freestyle, we're going to see the same exact things. So the head is not moving. The head is super stable. The head's in an absolutely great position. And even with the breathing, it's not moving side to side. And if you watch her torso, the hips aren't moving side to side. The shoulders aren't moving side to side. She's just rotating straight on that line, right along her spine. And even when the breath happens, she's not losing that position either. So things to pay attention to are the head being really stable. And even with the breath, right there, the head doesn't pull to the side to breathe. it just rotates and it just moves straight on that line. And then if we watch the arm actions, they're entering straight in front of her shoulders. And then she's pulling more or less straight back. She's not pulling out to the side a lot. She's not pulling way under her body. And so her arms aren't creating any lateral forces either, which would push her shoulders, her head, her hips, everything side to side. So extremely direct with the arm actions, really efficient with the head position, and then really stable with the head position as well, especially through the breath. That's going to allow her to be really effective at keeping everything moving straight, keeping resistance low, and that's going to help her create a lot of speed. So freestyle from another angle here, and what to pay attention to is watch the shoulders, watch the hips. There's definitely rotation, but you don't see any side-to-side motion as she's moving through the water. And so the head's staying really stable. She's moving it to breathe, but she's not pulling it out to the side. She's doing a really good job of rotating rather than bending, and that's allowing everything to move forwards, and that's allowing her to keep resistance low and to keep her speed high. And if we watch the arms here, they're going to be entering straight in front of the shoulders, and she's going to be pulling them straight back. She's not going to be pulling way under her body. She's not going to be pulling way out to the side. And those direct arm actions allow her to minimize the side-to-side motion and maximize how much she's moving straight through the water to keep resistance as low as possible. If you want to learn more about how to improve lateral alignment and prevent wiggling in both freestyle and backstroke, check out the videos below.